Good evening, everybody. This is the Needham Zoning Board of Appeals. I'm John Tamkin. I'm the vice chair acting as the chair tonight, and with me are Peter and Nick, who are the other panelists for the evening. The chair likes to say, and our procedure is that if for some reason the internet fails, the Zoom platform fails during the middle of our hearing tonight, it will be continued to the next public hearing. If we can post another hearing in time before the June meeting, we'll do that. If not, it'll be at the June hearing. But right now we have technology. Everybody is on Zoom and we're connected. We're being recorded by the Needham channel as well. So you're streamed live on TV at this particular point. First on our agenda is the adoption and approval of the minutes from our April 27th meeting. Has everybody on the board reviewed the minutes?
Yes.
I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll put a motion to approve the minutes from the April 27th meeting.
Is there a second?
There is a second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, it's approved. Second, we have one hearing this evening, and it's the application of EIP Rosemary LLC at 145 Rosemary Street. They've applied for a special permit under sections 5.1.15, 5.12, 5.1.3, and other applicable sections of the bylaw to waive strict adherence to off-street parking and parking design requirements. And the request is in association with the Wellesley Family Care Medical Office use, who will be expanding into 4,018 square foot of space formerly occupied for general office use. Again, the property is located at 145 Rosemary Street in the industrial and single residence B districts. At this point, I see Mr. Huber, counsel for the applicant. Would you like to introduce yourself and the other members of your group?
Yes, good evening. Thanks for taking your time. With me is Mr. Michaud from MDM Transportation, as well as John Hennessy representing the applicant.
Hello, John. Robert. And why don't you make your presentation, Evans?
Okay, so thank you. So we are here seeking a special permit on the same property that we have been before this board multiple times. And in each instance, the reason for the request is the same, that we are changing certain office space from general office use, which requires one parking space per 300 square feet, to medical office use, which requires one parking space per 200 square feet. So any such shift will increase the calculated parking demand under the bylaw. This board has granted a number of special permits waiving strict compliance with the requirements of the bylaw as to number of spaces and repeatedly as to certain nonconformities with the design requirements for the parking areas. In this case, though, it should be a relatively easy lift for the board. And the reason I say that is, although we are coming back to the board with an increase in the amount of space dedicated to medical office use, as you mentioned, an additional 4,018 square feet, we have actually, the client has actually restriped the parking lot without creating any additional nonconformities with the design requirements. So we have increased the number of parking spaces on site by 27, and the calculated parking demand increase is 7. So we are actually reducing the delta between the required parking and the available parking. So the last time this board approved the special permit request, the delta between the available parking supply and the required parking supply was 80 spaces. Now, because of the additional spaces that we've been able to create in our existing lot, the delta between the required parking supply and the available parking supply is only 60 spaces. Moreover, Bob Michaud from MDM is here to explain again why their analysis shows that the available parking supply of 311 spaces is more than adequate for what will actually be the demand as opposed to what the bylaw requires. So we're going to request, excuse me, we're going to request that the board grant waivers from strict compliance with the requirement for the number of spaces and for the certain design elements, the same design elements that the board has repeatedly granted waivers for in the past.
In these applications, and you have been before us a number of times, I think most recently in January.
Yes.
I think it would make some sense to briefly talk about your parking study, Mr. Michaud. Anything, you don't have to go in great detail, but some highlights with the new additional spaces.
Absolutely, yeah. So Chair and board members, good evening. For the record, Robert Michaud, Principal with MDM Transportation Consultants. I'll be brief. The board is familiar with the site. I will point out, and this slide is now on your screen, the updated site plan has been modified to reflect perpendicular parking spaces along the easterly building frontage that has effectively increased the parking supply in totality to 311 parking spaces on the property. That's up 27 spaces from the plan that the board had seen in January. The board now understands that Unit C1A, which is currently vacant and designated as office space, will simply be occupied by Wellesley Family Care as a medical office use at 4,018 square feet. No change in building square footage. To recap, the zoning requirement for parking under this scenario, there's more than 50% of the building occupied by medical office use under this scenario at 49,659 square feet versus 36,610 square feet for office. And applying the zoning requirements for each of those land use categories would yield a requirement of 370 spaces. I will point out that Attorney Huber in the application materials may have cited that as 371. The difference between those two has to do with rounding and whether or not you round each of the individual parking requirements by use, or whether you tally the calculated total between the two uses and then round up, right? That's the difference in that number. But the point is, we are seeking variance technically from those requirements. Now, in March of this year,
which would you prefer a board rely upon?
I would prefer that the board rely upon the calculation of the professional.
Well, we have two professionals, the other professional, not the lawyer.
Well, the professional who's qualified to make those calculations.
Got it.
I think certainly I think one could argue on both sides as to whether it's 370 or 371. It's simply a determination of when the rounding occurs, right? If you consider office as a standalone use with its own dedicated parking on the site, we would certainly take the 122.03 and round that up to 123. And the medical office from 247.85 to 248. And then the sum of those two values would be 371. That would be a more conservative approach to calculating that number, and perhaps because it's more conservative might be an appropriate basis for the board. That we'd rather be conservative than not.
Fine, thank you.
Yeah. So in March of this year, as we've done in the past, we've done a detailed parking accumulation study for individual zones within the campus, the entire site, shown in this diagram. And the results of those are very consistent between the 2 days that we surveyed in March. We surveyed in March 1st, Wednesday, this year, 2023. It would indicate that on that particular day, the peak parking demand across the entire campus occurred at about 10:30 in the morning at 228 parked vehicles of the 311 marked space supply. And then on Thursday, the following day, and I think I might have botched the March 3rd date, but it is that Thursday. It's actually March 2nd. We did the same thing and found that the demands were slightly lower at a peak of 214 parked vehicles at 10 in the morning. So our basis and the analysis reflects the higher of those two survey days at 228 parked vehicles. When we apply what we call empirical parking demand rates to each of the land use categories, office and medical office, we would generate an estimated increase of 36 additional parked vehicles, assuming retenancy of currently vacant office use. That would bring that peak total to 264 parked vehicles. In the scenario in which we are swapping out office and medical office land use codes, the 4,018 square feet, and we apply empirical rates to that, the combination of those two values would bring the entire parking demand from 228 to 268. That we believe to be the most appropriate and accurate representation of what the likely peak demand would be based on how the campus is currently performing and unknown measured characteristics of medical office uses in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Question for you.
Yes.
Question for you. Back in January, you conducted a study and it had a much lower peak demand. And you had basically, I think, 178 to 161. It was reduced spaces. Obviously, I think you had 284 back then.
Yeah.
Can you explain that, except maybe the occupancy was lower or something?
Yeah, that is the case. So since that survey was conducted, there's been an additional tenancy by a medical office use within the building. And I can't name which unit that was, actually. And John Hennessy is on the line. He can clarify which of those uses actually occupied the prior vacant space that was inventoried back in January. So the difference in observed demand has to do with the additional occupancies that actually occurred since that time that are now part of the survey in March of this year.
That was Ortho Boston, Bob. This is John Hennessy.
Yep, that was right. Ortho Boston. So Ortho Boston ramped up its operation, became fully occupied, and that additional difference in demand is associated with that use.
Thank you.
Yep.
I
Now,
just have one quick question, if
Sure.
I may. On the overhead aerial shots, it appears
Yes.
that's the same picture from all of them. Is that an aged picture?
it is. So what you'll see is in zone 4 and zone 5, parallel parking spaces. Those are the spaces that were remarked under the site plan to increase the parking supply. Right.
That's what I thought. I didn't drive back there and I just wanted to make sure I had it correct in my
Yeah.
head.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Based upon that picture, I've been with Equity Industrial for 16 years. That photo, we replaced the roof about 4 or 5 years ago. So that's the older roof. So that's at least 4 years old.
Great.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Now, beyond the empirical basis, which we think is a more accurate depiction of what the likely peak demand would be, we also apply industry standard parking demand rates, which are published by ITE in the Parking Generation Manual. And those tend to be a bit higher than what the empirical observations and data show. And ultimately, if we use the same process of first assuming reoccupancy of currently vacant office use, apply the ITE higher trip parking demand standard, rather than showing an increase of 26 peak parking spaces, we go to 39. And in the case of what we call method B, where we then convert that office space to medical office and apply industry standard parking rates to the office component, the cumulative peak demand goes to 273. So these are more conservative estimates of what that high side demand might be for the campus. And that high side estimate, which is based on ITE and industry standards, is what we rely on in our assessment, right? It's more conservative. So when we take that more conservative approach and we add, as shown in blue in this diagram, what those hourly peak demands look like beyond the inventoried March data, we see that at 10 to 10:30 in the morning, a peak overall demand of 273. That tapers off toward the middle of the day and starts to climb very slightly in the afternoon and then drops, indicating that even in the most conservative approach, we have at least 38 parking spaces in reserve that are not used. So we have an ample surplus of available parking on the campus to support all of the uses, including the reoccupancy of currently vacant office space on the site. So our conclusion, as it's been the case in the various iterations leading to this in prior applications, conclude that there is ample parking capacity to support the requested variance on parking. And I'll reinforce what Attorney Huber has said, and that is that relative to where we were in January, we actually have additional parking capacity. So we actually have a better situation now under this analysis than where we were back in January when we had fewer spaces.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you would restore my control to the Zoom, there you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
I felt very, very weak losing that button, but no problem. So I don't neglect the issues. I just want to read a couple comments that we received into the record. The building inspector agreed with the expansion and his typical detailed memo. He had no concerns. The town engineer had no objections or comments and has reviewed the proposal. The police department had no issues and no concerns, and the planning board submitted had no comments. I didn't have anything from the fire department in my package, nor the Board of Health. So I think that is the written departmental comments. I think at this point, Alex, is there anyone waiting in the public to join in or talk about this application?
There's two people from the public and nobody's got their hands raised. So unless they do in the next 10 seconds or so, I think you're probably good.
Okay. Peter or Nick or anyone on the board have any questions for the applicant or its team?
I don't have any questions. It's a typical, clear and persuasive presentation. Thank
No
you.
questions on my end either.
Then I think we'll close the hearing and deliberate. I'll lead off as always. This applicant and this operator and landlord does a very good job in presenting. They have very good attorneys and traffic analysis. I've commented in the past that the continuation of change over from general office to medical at some point will reach a limit. You've done a good job of expanding parking, so that's fantastic. And it's a well-run building, and I think many of the public have attended some office or medical clinic there, and you do a really good job. It's a very good presentation, and I have no concerns or on approving this special permit. Nick or Peter?
I would agree with that. It's, as I say, it's very clear. It seems quite clear in the real world that there is adequate parking.
And I too agree, and I think it's a great thing that you guys were able to squeeze a couple more spots in there for practical purposes as you approach almost 100% occupancy there, which is great for the town economically and everything else.
At that point, I would entertain a motion from Peter, perhaps.
Sure. You're breaking your string, John, if we're going to actually come to a decision. Just
Well,
want to
why
note
don't you
for
say
the
that
record.
for the public that I'd like to continue things for the full board for the next hearing when I'm serving as the chair. But no, we try to get
Yep.
things done here in Needham.
I would move that the board issue a special permit to 145 to EIP Rosemary LLC under section 5115 of the bylaw, waiving strict adherence to the required number of off-street parking spaces under section 5.1.2 and further waiving compliance with sections 5.1.3, I believe it's subparts A, I, J, K, and L of the bylaw relating to certain design requirements associated with the existing parking field in connection with the proposed occupancy of unit C1A 4,018 square feet by Wellesley Family Care for use as a medical office.
Is there a second to that motion?
I will second the motion.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Congratulations, it's approved.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Nice
much.
job.
Good to
Thank
see
you.
you again
Thank
and
you.
have a good evening. At that point, nothing else is before the board. Alex, anything else on your list? You're muted.
You'd think I'd be an expert by now. No, I have nothing else. It was nice to see everyone.
Okay, so entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. And I'm sorry, John, you want me to write this one?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll be happy to.
Nick, do you want to second the motion to adjourn?
I will second the motion to adjourn.
All in favor, say aye. We're adjourned. Be
Aye.
well. See you in June. Thank you so much for stepping in.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye, Nick. See ya.
Bye-bye.